everybody. It's nice to see you all again after the wonderful 5 sessions. We are into the sixth lecture in the series Archaeological Center webinar series. Today we have with us Professor Katherine Petrie from Cambridge University, who is a well-known scholar in the field of Harappan archaeology, but he has worked extensively in India, Pakistan, and Iran also. And he is at present a reader in the South Asian and Iranian archaeology at the University of Cambridge, and is very much actively participating in various archaeological projects and missions in India, Pakistan, and Iran. And his recent project in the northwestern part of India, and also his future projects, I believe they are really going to be an eye-opener on various aspects. He has employed a multidisciplinary approach and looking into various aspects, and including climate, which is a most crucial aspect in understanding the origin, the zenith, and ultimate decline of the Harappan civilization. Today, he is going to speak on climate, environment, and Indus civilization, which has its links with all the other aspects like the material culture and trade, and also various social and cultural aspects. But basically, this topic is based on his recent research on two important projects which he is currently undertaking in northwestern part of India. So I welcome Professor Katherine Petrie. It's a pleasure to have you with us, and I thank you very much to you to spare some of your valuable time to be a part of our lecture series. I welcome you once again, and I hand over to you to please deliver the lecture.
Thank you very much, Professor Prabhakar, and also Professor Sharada and Danino for hosting me. It's very kind to be invited, and it's very nice to be given this opportunity to speak for you, even though we're all spread out all over the place. I'd like to thank also, I know people are here attending. I know people from Australia, people from India, other countries, also in the UK. So hello to everyone that I haven't seen for a long time. Very nice to see you, even in this strange, strange way. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'll just have to make sure I get my logistics right at my end. I think you can see me now.
Yeah, we can see.
All right. So I think it's important to say from my side, what the presentation that I'm going to give you is in some ways it's the current standing or status of a research project that has been running since 2008, and it was work that I started with a collaborator, Professor R.N. Singh from Banaras Hindu University, and he and I have been working with a growing and changing team of collaborators, and we've been investigating the nature of human and environment relationships and interactions in northwestern India since 2008. We didn't necessarily set out to investigate climate change strictly. What we really intended to do was to understand long-term human settlement trajectories and change over time. So to try and understand a little bit about what were the parameters that saw the rise and decline of the Indus civilization, and also connections up to the early historic period in northwestern India. And in doing that, we chose a specific part of the country which has a lot of very particular environmental parameters. And in the end, we ended up getting some very, very interesting climate and environmental evidence. So I'm going to be talking about these two projects, the Land Water Settlement Project and the Two Rains Project. The Two Rains Project is still running. It continues until August of this year. But at a fundamental level, these two projects have circled around a question that has become ever more important during the life of the project, actually, and the relationship of humans and climate, and the importance of climate change as an issue, as a factor. And in some ways, the question of does climate change really cause collapse? And I think one of the things that became obvious to us while we were doing our work was that there's often very simplistic arguments that are made, certainly in the news media, sometimes by archaeologists, sometimes by climatologists, where they draw connections between climate evidence and archaeological evidence, and they just say this thing happened and that thing happened, so that they must be related to each other. But inevitably, when it comes to humans living in a context, explanations are much more complicated. So it's important that we move beyond the problems of the correlation of two events, meaning that those two events are connected, this correlation equals causation argument. And archaeology, I really strongly believe this, that archaeology is in a very unique position in being able to assess the impact of processes. So because archaeology allows us to look at the sort of before, during, and after aspects of an event, we get the opportunity to really get an understanding of, or a process, I should say, we get an understanding of how humans adapted their behavior. So one of the things that was very interesting, we got a piece of climate data in 2014, 13 and 14, it was published. And we submitted it to the journal Nature, and it was rejected for publication from the journal Nature. But when the article was actually published, you can see the headline in the lower right-hand side. The instinct was to make a catastrophic statement, a headline that a 200-year drought doomed the Indus Civilization. We'd been very careful in our publication not to say that, but that was what was said in the news media. So inevitably, archaeologists and academics generally have a problem whereby we make publications and we make press releases, and then the news media does often what it likes. This is not to say that the news media is absolutely wrong, but inevitably the story is more complicated. Now, what's really interesting for me, having worked in India and Pakistan for a long time and spoken to a lot of people who live in those countries, is very clear that the environment of India and Pakistan and the Indus River Basin, which is the area that I'll be speaking about, is extremely variable. So we know that there's periods of great water stress where there's drought and water is overused, but we also know that there are periods where there are enormous floods and far too much water comes. For example, this is the map on the left-hand side shows you the flooding that occurred as a result of the unusually strong monsoon rain in 2010, which affected the Indus River and flooded huge parts of Pakistan. So we have these contrasting aspects where we know that climate and environment are very, very important in the modern context, and we know that they can have dramatic impact upon societies. And you know, at various points in time, if you do a search on news media, you see reports about the possible impact of extended drought and how that will impact upon crop growing, water availability. You can see the map on the right-hand side shows you a map of India that shows areas that are currently under water stress. And you can see the majority of Western India, especially the areas in the Indus River Basin, are susceptible to water stress. So we know either too much or too little water can be a problem. And there's often statements that are made about the impact of climate and climate change on people. And now this is a modern, even more recent examples. This is an example from the Syrian civil war. And this news article points out that between 2007 and 2012, there was an extended drought that impacted upon northern Syria. Now, what that drought did was that it meant that rural populations moved from the countryside into the city. So that process of mobility, a drought resulted in the movement of people, and that actually led to provocations in political circles, protests, counteractions by the government. The Syrian civil war began. That then resulted in even more mobility. It resulted in different sorts of crisis. It impacted upon Europe. And, you know, speaking from the context of the UK, we now have a situation where we've had a vote that occurred that resulted in a dramatic change between our relationship between the UK and Europe as a result of all sorts of other interconnecting processes. Now, what's important is that climate in this instance is not the single cause of any of these processes, but it intersects with human populations in a whole range of different types of ways things like degrading resources, increasing levels of poverty, changes in politics and economy. So climate needs to be considered as an important factor. Now, where we are at the moment is actually quite interesting, because we've moved once again into a series of debates about the degree to which climate is viewed as a very, very prime cause of change and collapse. And we have an extremely polarized argument at the moment. On one side, scholars like Harvey Weiss, who would argue that there were phases of major climate change and drought that had direct impact upon human societies. And then other scholars like Guy Middleton, his book Understanding Collapse, you can see on the right, and other researchers who would argue that climate is really important and collapse may occur, or at least change may occur, but it's not a simple explanation of one equals the other. Now, that's been made even more complicated recently by a statement that was published in 2019, which divided up the modern period that we live in. The Holocene period, the Holocene epoch, was divided up into three parts. And this is the characterization of the Meghalaya age, which was named after the region of Meghalaya in India, where we had the discovery of a stalagmite, which you can see on the right-hand side, which has been sliced in half and then analyzed. And this stalagmite has been used to provide climate evidence. And what you can see at the very, very top is a very small piece of evidence that suggests that at around 4,200 years ago, there was what appears to have been a dramatic change in monsoon rainfall. And in the statement that was made about this particular event, they argued that there was a complete connection between the climate event and a global cultural event where we saw the collapse of societies. So this is again an instance where we've got archaeologists, some archaeologists working with geographers and climate scientists to present an argument about global catastrophe. And inevitably, knowing the chronology, the Indus civilization has slipped into these arguments. Now, the Indus civilization, some of you will be very familiar with. We know it spans across a very, very large area of modern India and Pakistan. I try often to refer to it now as extending across the Indus River Basin and its neighboring areas, because in some ways it's quite specific in its geography. But it's also very, very unusual in its geography as well. It's particularly extensive. We know that in the Indus context, cities existed and they lasted for around 600 or maybe 700 years. And then those cities declined. There was a process of deurbanization. And some scholars, going all the way back to the major excavators in the beginning of the 20th century, were arguing about whether or not there was a degree of collapse or decline, or some sort of transformation that took place within the Indus context. Now, what's interesting for me about the Indus civilization is that it's often referred to as a civilization or a complex society, and it's broadly contemporaneous with ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt. But in many ways, it's fundamentally different to the other complex societies of that period. One of the things that really marks the Indus civilization out as being different and distinct is its size, which I've already mentioned, but also it is described as being urban or urbanized. But in actual fact, we have relatively small number of very, very large Indus cities. And these cities are actually distributed quite dispersed in a dispersed manner across the landscape. Largely, they are at least 300 kilometers apart. So it's extremely different to what we see in Mesopotamia. Although the Indus civilization is connected to a river and a river system, which draws some parallels to Egypt and Mesopotamia, the distribution of the settlements and the way that they interact with their landscapes is actually quite distinctive and different. It's very clear that the populations of the Indus civilization made use of a combination of domesticated animals, some of which probably came from Western Asia, like sheep and goat, but also animals that were domesticated within South Asia, like the zebu and the water buffalo. They made use of wheat and barley, but they also made use of summer crops, and I'll talk about that in a little bit in a moment. And one of the aspects that I've tried to argue quite clearly is that the Indus civilization definitely had cities, but actually the rural component of the Indus civilization was extremely important. And that's something that actually is very revealing in terms of the way that Indus populations live and adapted to their environments. So what's interesting, there's lots of things that are interesting. What's interesting if we think about the Indus civilization and its relationship to climate and environment zones, this map shows you the different climate zones that characterize the area of the Indus River Basin. And you can see the areas that are shown in yellow are arid. The areas that are in light brown are semi-arid, and those that are in dark brown are more temperate. So the red dots on this map show you the location of Indus civilization settlements. Blue dots and yellow dots are contemporaneous settlements that belong to different categorizations of cultural material. But we can see that Indus populations lived in a number of different climate zones. Now that's quite interesting and important, particularly when we start to consider the way that they lived their lives and the types of plants and animals that they used. One of the things that I've also been very struck by and tried to emphasize a lot in visual terms is the fact that the Indus River Basin is also affected by both winter and summer rainfall systems. Those of you who live in the subcontinent know this as though it's just a part of every, normal reality. But in actual fact, this marks the Indus River Basin out as being quite different to all of the other regions where complex societies existed in this period. So ancient Mesopotamia does not get any benefit from the summer monsoon. Egypt does through rainfall up in the catchment, but not direct rainfall onto the area that Egyptian populations live. And similarly, in East Asia and China, they don't get the winter rains. So we see a set of circumstances where the populations are dealing with winter rain and summer rainfall systems. Each of these rainfall systems is a little bit variable, and it generates a degree of predictability in the sense that populations know that the rains will come, but there's unpredictability in the sense that the rain will always be variable. So that creates an interesting dynamic in terms of the parameters that people were used to living with. Now, we know a lot about the types of plants that Indus populations made use of. They used a wide range of cereals, pulses, oil seeds, and fibrous plants and fruits. And those crops were grown in both summer and winter, different crops. But we've also been able to sort of reconstruct that it was inevitably quite a complex endeavor to grow different crops simultaneously. And inevitably, I think the farmers were extremely knowledgeable, and they were able to schedule land use requirements, water availability, farm labor, and various sorts of other aspects of their daily lives. What will become clear is it's not possible necessarily to grow every crop in every area. And that perhaps should be self-evident, but it's not always stated so clearly. Now, the other parameter to think about in the Indus context is the nature of the hydrological system. We know that we have the Indus River, we have the rivers of Punjab, we have the Yamuna and the Ganges River, but we also have this other river system that has been reconstructed between these two river systems. And it's given a range of different names, including it's often connected to the river Saraswati. It's sometimes referred to as the Gaga Hakra. There is also other names that are mentioned. And it is interesting that there's been a long running debate about the degree to which this river, and the river that is now no longer carrying water, the degree to which that was connected to the ancient Indus civilization. Now, there's been several attempts to try and get some dates for when this river was carrying water. And inevitably, what we've ended up is I would say, quite a substantial amount of confusion in terms of the precise timing of when water was flowing in this river system. So, for example, there's been two different projects, one in Pakistan and one in India. And these have suggested that the project working on the on the part of the river system to the north of Cholistan suggested that this river system carried water up until 4,200 years ago, so 2,200 BC. But the suggestion that they made was that the river was a perennial river that was supplied by the monsoon rain, which to me, that's a paradox. We have the monsoon rain only falls in specific times of the year. So monsoon rain doesn't create a perennial water supply, but they're suggesting that it was a perennial river. They also suggested that the river changed around 4.2 thousand years ago and became an ephemeral river during the Indus urban period. A different reconstruction was proposed about 5 years ago in a paper published on samples that were analysed on the areas of northwestern India, and they argued that this river had not carried perennial water for over 8,000 years, so much earlier than the Indus civilization. So we have this, and there are other arguments that have been put forward more recently, different types of dates, different collections. I personally think that we have an understanding of why those different dates have been obtained, and I think in the end we don't have a completely reliable way of dating the river system that we're looking at, but we now have a much clearer understanding of it as a phenomenon. Now, what we know is that the Indus civilization underwent a process of transformation, and it seems to have taken place in the late part of the 3rd millennium BC, so from around 2200, 2100 BC, and we saw the peak of urbanism, and then over a 200-year period of progressive decline. We saw the abandonment of certain types of craft activities, the abandonment of all of the major urban centres except Harappa in Western Punjab, and lots of possible suggestions about why this process took place. Was it something like declining rainfall, desiccation, the exhaustion of resources? Were there invasions, social processes of social evolution? Lots of suggestions. I think in a way it's probably best to focus on the evidence at hand. What we do see is a decline of certain things that are very characteristic of the Indus civilization. Many of the elaborate craft production activities, things that have been referred to as involving technological virtuosity, disappear. So we lose Indus seals, we cease to see the Indus weight system. Some of the more elaborate bead technologies seem to fall out of use. What you can see on the map lower down, we seem to have a shift in the location of settlements. We have the movement away from some parts of the alluvial plain, and more settlements appearing in the areas to the east, in the northern parts of India around Haryana and Punjab, and also the areas of Saurashtra and Gujarat. So it's possible that populations were moving towards areas that were receiving higher or more reliable rainfall. And one of the things that we've suggested as part of our work is perhaps there was an increase in the level of unpredictability. So even though there was unpredictable rainfall in any one year, it was still it became more unpredictable about the amount and the frequency of rainfall in over time as well. The other aspect to mention is work that's been done. So it's a combination of work on the sort of settlement distribution, and also work that's been done on analysing human bones, particularly by Professor Gwen Robin-Shook and her collaborators. And what was clear is that there is this shift of settlement locations, and we seem to have evidence for things like social diseases and violence that are increasing in the late urban period. Things like tuberculosis, postcranial trauma, leprosy, and other things have all been identified from the skeletal remains at Harappa. So something is obviously changing. There is some sort of situation that is occurring in this context. And it has been suggested by several scholars that there was an increased shift towards the use of summer crops, perhaps as an adaptation, perhaps as a result of hydroclimatic stress, but we end up with a series of questions. So what I'm going to do now for the rest of the presentation is just to introduce you to the work that's been carried out in collaboration with my co-director, Professor R.N. Singh from Banaras Hindu University, as part of these two projects, the Land Water Settlement Project, which ran from 2007 till 2014, And the Two Rains project, which is started in 2015, is due to finish in August of this year. Now, these are collaborative projects involving lots of different institutions, different scholars. We've got funding from different funding agencies. We're inevitably working in collaboration and with permission from the Archaeological Survey of India. So there's a lot of people to thank, and I'll thank them. I'll either thank them by name while I'm speaking or at the end. But I think it's useful to say that in many ways, what we've attempted to do with our project work is to try and focus on how we understand human and environment relationships. And we've tried to do this by adopting a collaborative approach and an integrated analytical approach that works across disciplines. It's become clear that archaeology can't just operate independently and focus on its own identification of archaeological sites and digging holes in the ground. It's important to understand the nature of the environment people lived in, understand the weather and how weather operated, to understand the hydrology and how water availability worked in the region that they lived in. And to understand the archaeology as well, we need to understand archaeology in multiple dimensions, in a sense. We need to understand how, where settlements were located, what the local environment was like, what dates individual sites were occupied, when sites were being abandoned, and whether sites were being occupied and abandoned regularly, whether they were being occupied for the entire span of individual chronological periods. Look at the types of foods and animal products and animals that human populations were making use of, and how they obtained and managed their water supply, and also to try and get a good understanding of how they respond to change, whether it's a social change or whether it's a climatic change or any sorts of other aspects. And we try to do that in this sort of integrated package, integrated way of sort of looking at things. So the way I'm going to present it, I'll sort of give you a brief overview of what we've covered, starting from the sky and going down to the ground in many ways. So looking from the weather systems and the climate and all the way down to the types of microscopic results that we're seeing from our archaeological science analysis. So one of the things that became apparent to us as we were working in the early work is that we really felt that the important need to get a good understanding of the way that the summer and winter weather systems operated in the Indus River Basin. Now, often there's discussion of winter westerlies, things like western disturbances, Indian summer monsoon, and these are very well understood by weather scientists and people that work on the ground and collect this sort of information, but it's not always well understood in a way that archaeologists can sort of recognize how those parameters are important for the work that they do. The other thing is also that often some of these systems are modeled at a very high level in terms of understanding global weather patterns, and the modeling does not focus in detail on small regions, particularly what a weather specialist would regard as the very small region of the Indus River Basin. So what you can see here is a number of different illustrations that highlight change during the year. We can see that the winter westerlies or the western disturbances have different sources of moisture and different ways in which they impact upon the Indus River Basin, different evaporative processes, different locations and directions of wind, and as does the Indian summer monsoon as well. And what's extremely interesting is that the careful analysis of the weather patterns and the weather systems has shown that there is a considerable degree of variability in the rainfall. So it varies within 1 year, it varies between years, and those systems and cycles vary over different scales, like 10-year periods, over 100-year periods, or even 1,000-year periods. So there's long periods of oscillation and change. And there can be variation in seasonality, variation in the types of triggers that occur at a local level, and the degree to which synoptic disturbances take place. So we're dealing with a system that's extremely complicated and variable. Now, if we then try to match that to what's going on in the past, we end up with a lot of challenges, because to reconstruct weather and to reconstruct climate, you need to try and identify locations that have climate data a climate data record. One of the best ways of capturing a climate record is in ancient lakes, which collect pollen and also have shells, which shells record information about the degree to which the shells are growing under conditions of either water stress or water high water availability. And that is, it comes down to, because a shell, when it lives in a lake, is recording information on the degree to which there is input from rain and output from or extraction from evaporation. So they give you a measure on the degree to which a lake is either full or it's shallow. And that then gives you an indication of rainfall input and other sorts of indicators. Now, there have been attempts to collect paleoclimate information from different parts of India before, often from very ideal locations, several locations in central India, a number of dry lake beds in Rajasthan, for example. But most of these locations are at a considerable distance away from where the Indus Civilization populations were living. So what we attempted to do was to identify assess the literature and find lakes that had been identified by geologists, and then go out and sample some lakes in different locations. So in actual fact, building on the work done by geologists like Hari Singh Saini from the Geological Survey of India, and looking at lakes like Riwasa and Karsandi and Kotla Dahar in the southern parts of Haryana, we obtained paleoclimate records from these lakes, and we found clear evidence for climate change occurring at these different points that had been identified at this global scale. So around 8,200 years ago, and also at 4,200 years ago. So there's evidence that the summer monsoon, was weakening at quite specific points in time. But we also had evidence that the summer monsoon was stronger at other points in time, particularly in the period during the development of of Indus urbanism. So we seem to have an interesting pattern where we have rainfall being significant nonetheless. But how then do we connect that to other patterns? One of the other PhD students working on the project recently, Alina Gisha, analyzed samples from an old core that had been collected in the 1990s. And this is a very complex chart that shows a comparison of a whole series of different paleoclimate records. Each one of these graphs is a different climate record, but the two at the top show the results of stable isotope analysis of individual foraminifera species. These are small organisms that are being collected in sediments at where the Indus River flows into the sea. And what this analysis was able to show was that there was clear evidence for the graph, which is the second one from the top on both sides, shows clear evidence for the weakening of the Indian summer monsoon over time and a dramatic drop around 4.2. And the one which is the top on the right-hand side shows actually evidence for an increase in the winter, the winter monsoon up until around 4,400 BP, and then a very sharp decline from that period in both the winter and the summer rain. So it seems as though rather than there just being one impact of the winter monsoon becoming weak, the Indus River basin seems to have been impacted on both by a decline in rainfall in both of the critical seasons, therefore reinforcing this argument about unpredictability. So that's the climate and the weather. What's happening on the ground? From our side, it was particularly important to try and understand the nature of the hydrology of northwestern India. This is the area where we have the suggestions about the existence of the ancient Saraswati River and the possibility that there's a connection between ancient rivers and populations living on the landscape. So what we started to do was to look at ways of identifying the nature and complexity of the hydrological system, and working with a postdoctoral researcher, Hector Arango, who we're still collaborating with. He developed some innovative algorithms to identify multi-seasonal variation. And he also developed some methods of looking at microtopography and using high-powered computers and very, very large big data sets. Hector was able to reconstruct the complexity of the hydrological system of northwestern India. So you can see in the grey line in the middle, this is the course of the Gaga Hakra channel that is often discussed and was visible on satellite imagery in the 1980s. But all of the other lines on this map are different paleo channels that have been reconstructed and identified on the modern ground surface. What's very clear is that this is not a simple hydrological landscape, but it's extremely complex, and it's very likely that it changed with a lot of regularity. And these rivers probably are shifting. They maybe underwent what's called an avulsion process. When floods took place, they jump into different banks in different locations. It's recently been suggested in a paper published about 2 weeks ago that neotectonics was perhaps a very important part of this process. So the rise of the Himalayas and subtle adjustments in the topography mean that there's an increased likelihood that rivers are going to move as well. But what you can see on this map is that there's not just 1 or 2 or 3 rivers in this system, but literally hundreds of different possible channels that existed at different points in time. And it's quite likely that many of them existed at the same time. So I think it would be underestimating the complexity of the landscape to say that there was one mighty river that dominated this entire part of the landscape. And what you can see here, this is the reconstruction of the microtopography. You can see in actual fact there's many dozens of different river channels. You can see there is one major one here, but there's also river channels that run along the northern edge of the Rajasthan desert. And you can see at the top the areas of Rupnagar and the Sutlej River as well. So there's a considerable degree of complexity in the hydrology, and lots more that can be sort of speculated on and understood about the nature of settlement distribution and settlement change in this landscape. So now that we understand that part of the landscape, it actually helps us make sense of a lot of the work that's been done by many scholars over the last 30 or 40 years by looking at the distribution of archaeological sites in northwestern India, and the work that our project has been doing since 2008 on looking at archaeological surveys. Now, I'm not going to talk about all of the work, but what I will do is just give you a brief overview of some of the survey results that we've obtained. One of the things that we've been quite happy to make more commonly known is the fact that the survey of India maps that were generated starting in the late 19th century and continuing especially into the early 20th century actually provide us with an extremely rich record of distribution of ancient settlements on the landscape. Many maps that we have recorded the locations of archaeological sites. And you can actually see on the map on the lower right-hand side, there is the location on the top right of this individual map of Rakhigari and a whole series of other archaeological sites, including Lohari Rago and Masudpur sites that we've explored. Now, people had recognized that archaeological sites were being documented on maps as early as the 1940s and 50s, but there was no attempt to systematically assess that data. So we've started to do that systematically, developing methods, working in collaboration, researchers from Banaras Hindu University in Cambridge, including Aftab Alam, who I know is listening, and Adam Green, and other colleagues. We developed the use of an open data recording system that would enable us to use tablets in the field and make use of India's exceptionally good mobile network. And we were able to visit archaeological sites on the ground, map them quickly, and move between archaeological sites in a very specific way. So changing the way that archaeological survey was being carried out and making it fast and flexible and also very targeted. And in the process, we're able to sort of identify archaeological sites, such as the one on the left-hand side, use systematic methods to map them and assess them, and then end up with quite strong information about the location of sites, their size, and the specific periods in which they were being occupied as well. And we've used systematic methods at every site so that we can, in a sense, detect change over time in terms of the degree to which sites are being affected in the modern landscape, but also get information that is usable and reusable for archaeologists going forward. So one of the things that we've been able to do is to combine the evidence for the paleo channels that we've reconstructed across the landscape and the distribution of archaeological sites. Now, these are maps, works in progress maps. That's why I've put the image up on the right-hand side. So this is material that's not been published in this format before, and it may well change as we finalize the work that we're doing on it. But in a sense, this is an opportunity just to give you a snapshot of the way that archaeological site distribution changed over time from the period before, during, and after Indus urbanism. So this is the distribution of the pre-urban early Harappan settlements. Now you can see the major Gagar-Hakra channel moving across the central part of the image. And famous sites like Banavali and Birana and Kunal, which are located in quite close association to that channel. But we can also see that there's lots of sites that are located away from that channel, especially in areas further up towards Punjab, and areas down here around the site of Rakhigari and other locations in Haryana. Now, what's interesting to see is what happens when the Indus urban period occurred, and we see quite clear changes in the distribution of settlements. So areas to the north and to the west that had settlements in the pre-urban period seem to have become abandoned. Several settlements in the area around Rakhigari seem to have become abandoned as well. And there is likely to have been a concentration of settlement in the area around Rakhigari, especially in what we refer to as the hinterland. But it's also clear that there is settlement in many other areas across the plains of northwestern India. And some of these settlements do not appear to be associated closely with visible paleo channels that have been reconstructed. So it suggests that populations have different types of access to water. Then in the post-urban period, when we see Rakhigari abandoned, we see even further changes. More abandonment of different regions of this part of northwestern India, more concentrations of settlements in newer areas. There does seem to be a shift towards the east, but not a dramatic increase in the size of the population. So what this suggests is that there's a number of different complex dynamics that are happening in this process. And what's interesting is that there does seem to be continuity in water moving along some of these channels, but possibly also change in the way that water was being made available. What I think is probably most likely is that many of these rivers were perennial. So when the monsoon comes, these channels carry water, but they don't necessarily carry water throughout the year. And if you have a look at many of these channels that are visible, they're not big, straight flowing rivers, but they're very sinuous. And this suggests that they probably operated like nullas. They're not carrying fast flowing water, but they're much more meandering and gentle in their action. So it challenges some of the assumptions that we make about how hydrology worked in this area. Now, if we just draw the focus in a little bit more, looking at the areas that we focused on in the area downstream from Rakhigari, which you can see on the top right, we've excavated a series of sites, Lohari Rago 1, Masudpur 1, and Masudpur 7. Now, if we look at the topography, we now know that these sites are actually all located in close proximity to what is likely to have been one very, very sinuous meandering water course, which went past Rakhigari, past Lohari Rago 2, Lohari Rago 1, and the other Masudpur sites as well, and actually headed off down towards the northern parts of Rajasthan. So we looked at this area in the landscape. We've started to understand the paleo channels that we can see. But what's interesting is that these paleo channels are completely invisible on the modern ground surface. This is the archaeological site of Masudpur 1. It does not look like anything other than agricultural fields. But you can see this green field in the sort of top center part of the image is actually the main part of the site of Masudpur 1. And we've assessed the underground topography of that site by work. One of the PhD students on the project, Joanna Walker, did a systematic coring program, and she's been able to reconstruct the nature of the archaeological landscape that existed underneath the modern ground surface at several different sites. This particular image shows what we think is present under Lohari Rago, the presence of a channel, probably the presence of an ancient pond immediately adjacent to the site, and different types of land around the settlement, suggesting probably the likelihood that the ancient farmers must have used different crops in different parcels of land. We've also attempted to look at the distribution of the material on the surface of these sites, identify areas that are likely to have been occupied in different periods. And then we've conducted detailed excavations to look at the complex living arrangements within the settlements, look at the types of the buildings that they were using, how they were using pits, and the types of material culture that was present. So we've conducted most recently excavations at Lohari Rago 1 and Masudpur 1. And we found very similar types of deposits in each of these sites. These are not sites with any sort of large and elaborate architecture, but seem to be relatively straightforward town or village settlements. They are dominated by local types of pottery that's being produced, and some degree of influence of other pottery styles, and very, very limited evidence of the possibility of the importation of pottery from other locations, which is particularly interesting. There's an abundance of this quite distinctive, distinctive locally made pottery assemblages, but some distinct, characteristic types of Indus pottery as well. Things like perforated vessels, toy carts, figurines of zebu and horned animals and other sorts of things. So we have this interesting mix of local and possibly not local connective evidence. So you can see on the top right, we have evidence for things like gold beads, lapis lazuli beads, suggesting very long range connections, carnelian, steatite beads, which are very, very common as well. So these populations are operating in some ways, a village population is operating in a very small scale, but they're also interacting with broader networks of connectivity. Now, what was interesting for us to sort of get to the how people are living in this environment question was when we started to look at the archaeobotanical evidence and the animal bone evidence. And it became clear that rather than the populations of a site like Masudpur 1 and Masudpur 7 adopting different crops as a result of an adaptation to weather stress, it became very clear that the populations living in these sites were always making use of crops like millet and rice and wheat and barley. So we have very clear evidence now for use of rice before the urban period, clear evidence for the use of millet and wheat and barley. And this comes from a number of sites, most particularly Masudpur 7, but also Masudpur 1. And we have these are pie charts that show the very straightforward statistics that differentiate between the growing of winter or summer crops at each of the sites. The sites are shown in the vertical columns, and horizontally you can see the early pre-urban Harappan, mature urban Harappan period, late Harappan, and afterwards, moving up horizontally. And these are arranged in a way that you can see the settlements that are located furthest to the west are shown on the left-hand side, and the settlements located furthest to the east are shown on the right-hand side. Now, what you see is actually very interesting patterns. We see over time, there seems to be an increase in things like the use of millet and the use of rice and the diversity of the crops, but we see a lot of variation within the system. And if we just look at the evidence from these two sites, Masudpur 1 and Masudpur 7, we can see that over time at Masudpur 7, there's a change in the types of crops that were being used, a shift actually from the use of millet, dominant, which is the green color, towards the use of wheat and barley in the mature period, which is the yellow color. And then in the post-urban period, a shift back towards millet as the dominant crop, but also an increased use of rice. So at one site, we see change in the agricultural profile. But if we look at Masudpur 1, which is the two circles in the middle, you see two sites that are probably occupied at the same time, and the crop assemblages at those two sites are different. So whereas Masudpur 7 seems to be focusing on wheat and barley, Masudpur 1 seems to be focusing on millet and rice. So what this suggests to us is that there is extreme variability in the farming systems of the populations of northwestern India, probably being dependent upon local conditions, the exact chronological period, how much rain people were getting, and all sorts of different types of choices. Now, that's particularly interesting when we look more broadly at what we know of the Indus civilization generally. So we know that winter rain falls up in the Himalaya, drops snow. We get western disturbance rain across the plains. We know that the summer monsoon drops rain on most of, heavily on parts of peninsular India and the Ganges Valley to the north, and also on the Himalaya as well. But what we see actually in the archaeobotanical record is an interesting pattern. The majority of the crops being used in Gujarat, as far as we can work out, seem to be summer crops, although there is some evidence for the use of winter crops as well. The area of Sindh is not well known, and I think when a paper was published in 2017 speculating on what we might expect, it was we expected probably that there was the dominance of winter crops in this area, but new work that's being done by Pakistani and Spanish researchers in Sindh is suggesting that they were perhaps also using millet in southern Pakistan as well. And then it's likely that there was a degree of variability up in the north in the different parts of Punjab, whether it be Western Punjab or Eastern Punjab and Haryana in India. We know from the archaeobotanical work at Harappa that there seems to be a dominance of winter crops, but also the use of some summer crops like millet. And that's interesting, but it's actually also quite clearly different to what's happening in northwestern India, where it seems like farmers were able to engage in a very flexible farming system. This suggests that they were adapted to the local context. And that's before, during, and after the Indus urban period. It's extremely interesting. So people are engaging in very specific types of practices. Now, what's interesting from our side is when we start to look at what we can say about animal diet, for example. So this is some stable isotope analysis of animal bones that were identified by Professor Joglika from Deccan College. And his collaborators and students have also worked on this material as well. And using their identifications, we conducted stable isotope analysis of animal teeth to try and look at diet, animal diet. And what was very interesting was that there was clear differences in the type of diet that cattle, zebu and water buffalo were consuming in contrast to sheep and goat. And if you look at this chart, you don't need to look at it strictly in detail, but what you can see is that the lines that are in the black with the circles are zebu, and the vast majority of them are very, very flat. And this is a range, so you can see the pre-urban, the early Harappan, mature Harappan, and late Harappan across the top, and some other samples underneath. But the indicator, what we're able to see from these samples was an indication that most of the zebu and the water buffalo are very likely to have been consuming C4 plants, which is largely millet. And it's possible that they were being fed these crops. They were being foddered quite deliberately on certain crop types. It's also clear that sheep and goat had a much more varied diet. So it looks quite likely that probably what we would assume is happening is that there is a difference between the way that sheep and goat are being managed and the way that zebu and water buffalo are being managed. And what's really interesting is that this same pattern occurs in Gujarat and from what we have also seen in other areas as well. The other piece of the puzzle is to try and draw together what we know from the plants and the animals to try and understand what humans were eating. Now, this is some of the plots that were recently published in a paper by one of the former students from the University of Cambridge, Aksheta Surinarayan, where she had conducted some compound-specific stable isotope analysis of residues from pottery vessels. Now, this was, I guess, it's extremely difficult to summarize the findings from this study in 1 or 2 slides. But what's extremely interesting from the analysis is that it was quite possible to differentiate different fats being left as residues in the pottery vessels. And you can see this sort of spectrum here, and you can see relatively small numbers of samples have a close association with cattle and dairy products, but which is interesting because that we have very high proportions of cattle and buffalo bones in the animal bone assemblage. We have very small proportions of pig bones in the assemblage, but what we see is actually complex residue analysis signals that are coming out of these pottery vessels. So it suggests possibly that there's a mixing of different types of animal and plant fats in pottery vessels. Now, what's interesting in this particular chart is you can see that the colors are indicating samples from different sites. So you can see in the lower right-hand side down here near where the milk bottles are shown, we have very small numbers of samples that may indicate the use of vessels for dairying. And these all are coming from different sites. But we have large numbers of samples that seem to show the mixing of different types of fats in these vessels. And these are also coming from different sites. And if we look briefly at the different types of pottery vessel, we see no type of consistency. So there's no one vessel that seems to be being used for one specific process, but we seem to possibly have different types of vessels having evidence for different types of food preparation as well. Now, just to try and draw all of this to a close, the final part of our work that we're engaging in at the moment is to try and build agent-based models to try and combine all of the different data sets that we have. So to combine things like water availability, the type of land, the settlement location, things like diet and size of populations, decision-making, the size of households and the size of populations, and to try and then look at the decision-making processes and the degree to which certain decisions would have been successful in specific contexts and specific locations. Now, this is work that's actually happening right now, and we're getting to the point of being able to start publishing these models to try and speculate about the way that Indus populations managed their resources and lived in the specific environments of northwestern India. Now, just to finish off, I guess probably the thing to say is that we're in a provisional stage of drawing the broader conclusions from the overarching process. But partly we're looking at the ways of trying to explain the connections between what we see as an urban process and what we see as a rural process. What happens in cities and what happens in villages. Now, in the Indus context, we know that we have Indus urbanism develops, and these cities are occupied for a very long period of time, 600-700 years. And then they gradually abandon and largely disappear. Now, what's interesting is that those settlements, even though they seem to be occupied and become urban, they don't remain static. They're constantly changing. And it's quite likely that these settlements were perhaps, you could argue that there was a degree of fragility in an urban settlement, perhaps as a result of the fact that urban settlements need to rely on resources coming in, different types of activities, populations being able to be large and being able to survive and work together. But what we see in some ways is something quite different in the urban trajectory in the Indus civilization, where we see the increase of village settlements, a reduction of the scale of interaction, changes in the types of network interaction that we see. And in actual fact, what I would argue in the background is quite clear evidence for the sustainability of rural populations and their resilience to change. They're adapted to weather that's complicated, and they maintain their local practices and their local approaches to subsistence. They make use of winter and summer crops as is available. And in a way, I would suggest that the smaller size of populations that are living in villages are very well suited to mitigating risk. And what's clear from that information about settlement distribution is that probably populations in the past were very able to move around the landscape as was required, whether or not a region became unviable, whether it was a family relationship where parts of families needed to move. But it suggests that ancient Indus populations living in the rural sector were very flexible. They were resilient, and they were able to survive these complex changes in their environment. Now, I hope it's a very long story. I hope it's been reasonably clear. I'd just like to finish by thanking all of my colleagues and collaborators from Banaras Hindu University and the University of Cambridge. There's a long list of people here. They've participated in many different ways. I think almost all of this group has participated in our fieldwork in some way, shape or form. And if they haven't done that, they've been involved with laboratory work. I'm grateful to all of their support and help. I'm also grateful to my own department and the Department of AIIHC and Archaeology and BHU, Archaeological Survey of India and the funding bodies. And I will stop talking. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Cameron Petrie. It's a wonderful talk on various aspects, and it really reveals how complex the Indus civilization. I mean, we think it as a homogeneous. I mean, most of us think it is a homogeneous culture, but it's really complex, and we really need to study the more the rural settlements to understand the kind of organizations they had. Now we move on to the question answer session, but to start with, I have one question. You mentioned about the perenniality and the kind of abandonment, or maybe the different parts of the entire Ghaggar Hakra system in which they were active. I mean, don't you think that River Satluj had a major role to play the perenniality of Ghaggar Hakra system rather than the entire river system? And don't you think the Rocky Gadi and the adjoining sites, they were also part of the Drishadwati system, which might have been what is a kind of a perennial in a particular point of time during the 3rd millennium BCE?
They're important issues and questions. So they're actually slightly different ones, though. So the argument, the Sutlej is really important. So we know where Rupar is, and you've worked there, and it's very clear that river has gone. It's had major avulsions, and it's changed its course at different times. So yes, that is a perennial river, no question. And it's very clear that has fed into the system at some point in time. But that one river would not have been able to produce a water supply for the whole of northwestern India. And the argument about the Drishadvati is actually really complicated, because what's really clear, I showed it in the map, but perhaps it wasn't obvious. So the Ghaggar Hakra course, which runs across past Birana, Banavali, that's the one that people often speculate was the Sutlej coming that way. So that would have been that part of the course, but that is actually about 70 kilometers, 80 kilometers away from where Rakhigarhi is located. And the larger channel that is visible there is probably a different type of channel to what you see in other parts of the plain. And what I think has happened is that floodplain has developed quite rapidly, and the river has gone through several avulsions, and it's moved across the landscape. So, there is arguments at the moment about whether the Sutlej moved once or whether it moved many times, and we can't answer that question at the moment. And we don't know exactly when those shifts were happening. So that's the Sutlej is really interesting, and it needs more attention. The one date that was published in this paper by Ajit Singh and colleagues in 2017, they suggested it was 8,000 years ago that river moved. I think the story is more complicated than that. Definitely. What's clear is probably that one part of that channel stopped at that point. But what we don't know is how it moved across the landscape. There was this recent paper that was suggesting that it's very, very complicated. And I think what's quite clear from the map that I showed is that there's lots of other supplementary channels. So it may well have moved incrementally, but the speed of which it moved, we don't know. And we don't even know whether it was in the 3rd millennium. It may have been much earlier. The Drishadvati question is a really important one as well, because I didn't emphasize it, but there is a possible input from the Yamuna. And this has been talked about for 50 years, going back to Yashpal and some of the other suggestions. I mean, Michelle's written a whole book on this river system. So, I mean, it's extreme. I mean, what's really interesting is that there are definitely records of the river system carrying water much more recently. And people are now finding dates that suggest that these rivers, sediment was moving much more recently. But the connection and the degree to which they're perennial is the question, as far as I'm concerned. I think because they don't have to be perennial to be important. I think that's the critical thing. And looking at the formation of that river that goes past Rakhigarhi, that's not a massive river at all. It's a much, much smaller river. And so, I mean, what I really want to know, and I don't know for sure, is whether or not it was perennial, because if it was perennial, where is the water coming from? We don't really know. And I mean, at the moment, it's invisible, that you cannot see it at all. And the hydrology has been changed so much, it's very difficult to work out the period. So I think there's definitely a water course there, but at the moment, it's unclear that it's perennial. That's really the critical bit. And I think if we actually, I think for me, if we say it doesn't have to be perennial to be interesting and important, then that actually lets you think in other ways. That's really that's how I think about it anyway. It's a very long answer to your question. Sorry.
Yeah, it's very complex. I mean, it indicates the complexity. And one more question from my side would be, I mean, what we see is that a lot of sites on the old courses, like on the old course of River Beas, or I mean, no new sites on the new course of Beas and Satluj combined together. That also clearly indicates that was not the course during the Harappan period or the 3rd millennium BCE. And one more indication is that Satluj being shifted several times, it could have obliterated so many sites that had been existing at that point of time. Is there a possibility? Do you think is there a possibility for that?
That's a really good question. So that the reconstruction of using that topography to reconstruct the watercourse, you can actually almost draw a line that shows the floodplain of these rivers. And what we're hoping, and this is the next phase of the work that we're doing, is to try and identify the location of more of the historic period sites, to try and work out when those river systems were active and when they were not. Because at the moment, we think it's possible to differentiate the different types of landscapes. So there's almost like an Indus period landscape, and then there's a historic period one, and there's a clear change in the hydrology between those two. And you're right about the Beas and the Sutlej, because I think those rivers, that's the other problem about a perennial river. If it is a perennial river, they probably move and it destroys the landscape, so you actually can't see things. So that's another reason for me, I think, why that's where my instincts suggest that if there must have been a perennial river across that part of northwestern India, but it didn't obliterate the Indus sites. So that means it must be older, if that makes sense, which is really interesting, because that's then, okay, well, how then do we understand this process? Whereas if it was later, it would have damaged the archaeology. If it was a massive river in the historic period, it would have carved through the landscape in a different way. So I think there's those sorts of ideas we need to develop in our thinking about, it's like a stratigraphy. How do we understand the stratigraphy of these settlements? But at the moment, one of the challenges is that there's so much focus on the Indus sites. Everyone wants an Indus site, including me. And you know, so you want to find those, but people are not paying attention to the medieval sites and the historic period sites. So we're not seeing the whole picture of the landscape process. So there's lots to do. There's a lot to do. It's really interesting. And I think both in India and Pakistan, I mean, there's both parts of Punjab, the part of Punjab in Pakistan and the part in India are very under-surveyed. There's really not very many sites that are known in those regions. So we don't have a good understanding of settlement distribution. So that's you and I have talked about this already. There's a lot that needs to be done. It's really quite exciting.
Yeah, thank you. And now I would request Sharada to moderate the question and answer session.
You're muted.
Yeah. So I see there are only 2 questions, which clearly shows that your talk has been very comprehensive and
I've
leaves no stone unturned. Nobody has anything, no doubts, nothing at all. I had a very small thing because I worked on Farmana remains, and I saw in one of your maps that you had put a small blue square next to it, indicating that it's an early Harappan site. I was a bit, I'm even after all these years, I'm still unsure whether there is any early Harappan in Farmana or not, because the original excavator, I mean, Professor Shinde found remnants of a pig dwelling in one of the trenches, and I think a few early Harappan ceramics. So he was insisting that there was early Harappan, but when Akinori published his reports on ceramics later, and I had a talk with him, and he very emphatically denied that there was any early Harappan in that site, although it was a multicultural site, but it could have only come to be settled during the mature Harappan and later. So why did you put that? Has that kind of been settled, or
no, sorry, that's a very good question. On the same map, actually,
because I will have to revise if it is early Harappan, I don't have to revise my thesis, but if it is not, I have to revise my thesis.
It is very interesting, because I've had conversations both with Professor Shinde and with Akinori about this issue. So the majority of Akinori's publication of the pottery is from the top phase, whereas I do know that they did those small soundings into the lower parts, and and I've never been able to understand it properly myself. But the explanation of the maps. So I mean, to be honest, I don't think I wouldn't be surprised if there is some early Harappan material there. What has become really interesting for us is that our understanding of the ceramic assemblages have changed a lot, because we've actually analyzed, I'm just trying to think, 6 or 7 of these sites now, and most of our work was doing vertical soundings. So we're trying to understand the change over time. It was a very specific approach that we were using. And it was only in the recent excavations that we did what happened at Farmana, which was the horizontal work. But what we learned when we excavated the material, and then we analyzed the pottery, and then we got the radiocarbon dates, and the radiocarbon dates always were different to what we expected. And what was really interesting is that sometimes, and it wasn't much, but it was just enough on occasion to suggest that, okay, so sometimes we thought we saw early Harappan pottery, but it was transitioning into the beginning of the urban period, for example. So it suggested that there was continuity in the use of that material. And then, which is really interesting. And then once we looked more closely, you could actually differentiate the two. There was some change, but it's not as sharp as you would hope. So the material, it's not like everyone says, okay, let's throw out the early Harappan pottery. We have to start using the mature Harappan pottery. It doesn't work that way, and which is interesting, because I think, I was trained to identify pottery. This is this one, and this is a different one, and you do that when you're in the field. And it was very clear to us that there was these differences. So at the moment, all of that analysis is just being finished now. We're going to start publishing the papers, and I suspect some people will be very angry with us, because we're going to mess up the chronology. But I think what it will see is we have to divide those periods up. So the early Harappan will have to have sub-periods, and the mature Harappan will need sub-periods, because there is change within those periods as well. But yeah, the issue with the Faramana date, so that's a little bit of a mistake. The blue squares are there to show well-known sites. So if you, on the map, actually, I realized Kunal is shown as an early mature and a late Harappan site, which is a mistake. And yeah, Faramana shouldn't be early mature and late also. I think even Rakhigarhi is early mature and late, which is, we know. That's like I said, I was trying to say they need to be changed, those maps. They're not necessarily as accurate as they should be.
Those maps are still very good standardized maps. I mean, they're still very well made. So I see only 2 questions here, and both are by the same participant, Shikha. So the first one says, do you feel that that now there is a need to understand ruralization rather than urbanization in the context of Harappan civilization? Then only we can understand the South Asian culture in a better manner.
I think that it's a really interesting question. I think the information that comes from urban sites is completely specific and distinct, and I think we have to study it. There's always more work to be done on urban settlements, and actually many of the sites that have been the big sites still haven't been fully published. So there's so much work to do on that side. I would definitely say all of that work needs to continue. I just think we also need to add the ongoing attention to the rural component as well. So it's not so much a shift. It's doing the 2 things together. That's what I really think is important. I mean, I also know we don't have to do much excavation at a little site to get so much material. So I think it's very easy to generate a massive amount of material. So I think perhaps more than anything, we just need more people working on the subject area. That's
okay. So now that the questions are coming in. So the next one is, what kind of methodological problems you faced while conducting multidisciplinary application in the region of Haryana? And I especially want you to tell me a bit more if you had any kind of contamination. And what did you do with, or if you had any erroneous results, what would you do?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So there were 2 problems that we had that came up regularly. One of them was a problem of preservation. So most of the sites, and the preservation has 2 parts. So there's a lot of big challenges for anyone interested in the archaeology of Haryana and Punjab because of the scale of agricultural intensification. So many sites are being damaged. Almost every site we visit is damaged, and many are being destroyed by just normal agricultural processes. But the other component of the preservation is that the sites are they're not big sites. So some of these sites in Gujarat that have the big walls around them, they're actually quite safe in a way. We try very hard to destroy a site like that. Whereas in Haryana, they're made out of bricks, mud bricks, and they're not very solid. So they can be plowed away and things. But because they're also not very high, and that means they're subjected to the winter and the summer rain, and they get different environmental conditions. So we get very bad biological preservation. So it's been very difficult to do the archaeobotanical analysis. So there's been several different people that have worked on our archaeobotany, Jennifer Bates and Jemre Ustankaya, Anuba Patak, who's worked from BHU, and they're always struggling to find the material. There's just not much seeds and material. That makes it difficult because there is also an issue of contamination. Usually we've been very careful and we've found it. So what we also know is that a lot of these sites have got medieval or early historic pits excavated into them. Thankfully, it's really obvious. The figurines are totally different and the pottery is different. So usually, as long as we're careful enough and we identify the pits, we can remove the contamination. We've been very careful with the dating. Actually, we were doing direct dates on the seeds, and so we know that the seeds are not contaminated. So that was really useful. That was the thing with the rice. We got rice in very early deposits, and everyone said, "Oh, we don't believe you." So then we analyzed the rice and we got dates from the rice, and then we know for sure. So yeah, it was that was reassuring. But yeah, we definitely have all of these problems with pits being cut down into deposits, walls being cut into deposits, all of these same archaeological issues.
Next, we have Professor Konrad Elst, who gave a talk just a few days ago for us at IIT Gandhinagar. So he asks, in all your years of excavations, have you ever discovered innovations that can only be traced to elsewhere?
Oh, trying to work out how to answer that question. So, in terms of the archaeological discoveries, I mean, I think it's very interesting in the Indus region, because I think there is both innovation and adoption of other things from different locations. So there's definitely, the Indus civilization is very notable. You've got, wheat and barley, which are probably domesticated somewhere else to the west, mixed with millet and rice, which are domesticated in different parts of the subcontinent. And it's all coming together in this specific mixing pot, however you want to describe it. And we know that zebu and water buffalo are being domesticated in Indus region, but the sheep and goat are probably coming in from further away as well. So there is a constant set of mixing. I think really for me, all of these periods are marked by, I think, movement. People are in contact with each other. We know that there's contact with Central Asia. We know that there's contact with Iran, Northern India, Central India. So yeah, it's the specifics of the innovation are interesting though. So I mean, it does. I think there's a complete combination of things. So we see, innovations in metallurgy happening in the Indus civilization, innovations in bead production and seal production. And sometimes we see products coming in from outside as well. Sometimes they're ideas, but I don't think there's any absolute separation. I think there's a lot of connectivity. It's a very long and winding answer, Conrad, sorry.
So next up is Saran Adhar. He is a student of IIT Gandhinagar. He's from the discipline of Earth Sciences, and he's worked a lot on climate with Professor Vimal Mishra, and he finished his PhD recently. I think I have got most of his details right. But so he says, thank you for this great talk. Is there any role of human activities in the shift of Satluj River? Any major construction of reservoir, for instance, or only due to natural activities like change in monsoon, variability, tectonic movement, etc.?
That's a really interesting question. So it's very interesting because I mean, today there's major infrastructure projects where we have canals and reservoirs and river systems that are built. I mean, we know, for example, at Dolavira, we have these reservoirs, we have channeling of water and other sorts of things. But I think my understanding of, for example, at Dolavira, the water supply at Dolavira, that's coming from the controlling of monsoon rain and the channeling of it as required. I think the Sutlej River is something completely different, and I think it's a very different scale of a river. And I think anyone that was trying to build a reservoir or building canals to try and control the Sutlej, it may work for the year that the channel was built or the reservoir that was built, and it may work for 5 years afterwards. But as soon as there's an unusually high rainfall system, the river probably just does whatever it wants, and it would be very difficult to control. So I think even if a reservoir was built to try and tap that water, I think the river would have done whatever it liked. And I mean, I think the big things that have changed more recently is the construction of barrages and other things. So dams to channel the water and restrict movement, and the irrigation colonies and all of these other things. But most of those big changes have happened in the last 150 years, 200 years. Whereas I think the types of ideas that you're mentioning there about, construction of reservoirs or canals, I think it's unlikely that those things were happening in the Indus period. No one has ever produced evidence of a large scale canal that dates to that period. There's small ones, we know definitely, but nothing like what we know that existed in Mesopotamia, where they were diverting the river on a massive scale.
Okay. Professor Atushi Noguchi asks, I think both wheat and barley are winter rain crops. So what was the trigger to introduce these plants into summer rain dominant areas of South Asia?
It's a good question, Atsushi. It really is. I mean, it does make you wonder, because I suspect there's two things. Are the crops being grown locally wherever they're being found? You know, for example, if we find wheat and barley at Dholavira, is it being grown in Gujarat, or is it being moved from somewhere else to Gujarat? And there are ways of working that out. So you can actually, you know, if you look at the crop assemblage and they've got crop production residues and other things, you could say, okay, it's likely that this was being produced locally, or was it being shipped in? But it's very interesting. So I think several people have started to think about the possibility that wheat and barley was significant culturally. It was important to use these crops in terms of, you know, what that means, whether it's because you're eating bread or the types of food that you're making out of them. And it's interesting that wheat and barley are actually, they're different to each other. Wheat requires more water, barley requires less. So in theory, barley should be successful in arid areas when wheat may not be. But it is interesting that both of them are appearing together. I think it doesn't surprise me that both of those crops appear in northwest India, in Haryana and Punjab, because they get enough winter rain, so they can, and they grow. And this is the area now where wheat and barley is being grown in massive quantities. Wheat and barley in Gujarat is a different phenomenon, because they don't get anywhere near as much of the winter rain. But it's a really good question. So it must be a combination of cultural. There's a cultural preference, so there's a choice that's being made, definitely. But whether or not whether it's imported as a product, or whether it's being imported as a crop that's being grown locally, that's something that really, I think we need to work more on that to see, because I think we can actually identify. My understanding is, I've never seen it done, you can actually do strontium analysis of the seed grains and work out whether or not they've been moved. I don't think anyone's got enough seeds to test it yet, but I think that's a PhD waiting to happen, that one.
Okay, so Shikha asks, where do you keep Soti Siswal phase in that region? Is it early Harappan phase? And what is your opinion on Virana's date of 8th millennium BC?
Yeah, I have to admit, I'm a bit confused by the very, very early dates from Virana. I haven't really, there's apparently, there's 3 or 4 dates from one phase at Virana, and they span 4,000 years. So that doesn't make any sense to me. So I think there's something about the excavations at Virana that need to be, we need to think about it more clearly. Either we need to have the stratigraphy published and then try and connect the dates to it, some careful identification and interrogation. It may be necessary to go again and dig a very small sounding and redo the dating, because I think it's those dates are confusing to me. I don't understand them, mostly because we don't have enough information about those dates. Yeah, so that's why I think Virana is an amazing site. It's very big as well, and there's unfortunately very little material published from it. The main thing that everyone knows about is the dates, and there's some analysis of stable isotopes and other sorts of samples. Yeah, but it's a really great site. I think it needs. There's many of the sites, actually all of those interesting sites along the, Saraswati Gagahakra channel. We need to know more information. Virana, Banavali, Kunal, all of these sites, we need more information.
Professor Korisetter asks, what happened to the 750 wells at Mohenjo-daro around 2000 BC?
That's a good question, Ravi. So it is interesting, because I think, Mohenjo-daro, it's quite clear that the size of the settlement reduces. So, parts of the settlement are abandoned. So, presumably it became, for whatever reason, it became difficult to live there. But yeah, there's still, that number is a calculation, because that's the Michael Janssen making an extrapolation the number of wells found from the excavated areas and saying, okay, we got, I think it's 70. They found 70 wells in the excavated area, and then he timed it by 10, so he got 700. Whether they all date to that period, I don't know. But yeah, it's a logic loop. I think that's one of those really important questions. Again, I mean, maybe we could get a better answer to that. I mean, there's so much work that has been done on Mohenjo-Daro that I think is still to come. Are still not fully published yet. So I hope we can get some clearer answers about exactly which parts of Mohenjo-Daro were occupied in which periods and things like that. So.
Okay, I think this is the last one. Holly Cook asks, further to the question of reservoirs, is there any evidence of large-scale water cisterns to ensure water supply in the time of a drought?
That's a good question. So yes, there is. So as those who know Dolavira or who are currently working there, we know that there are there's big water reservoirs at Dolavira. There's the harbour / reservoir at Lothal, which we know, and so these are substantial water capturing features. What we have in the site that we worked on, this site of Lahari Rago, we found that there was a big pond right next to the site, and that seems to be occupied at the same time as the settlement. So it was very interesting from us. That wasn't expected at all. But so it looks like the populations were diverting water out of the river channel into the pond, and that was really interesting. So that gives them a source of water. It also lets clay form in the bottom of the pond, so they have a source of clay as well. And that sort of thing is common. So what's traveling around northwestern India now, every village has one or more ponds. Unfortunately, the majority of them now are falling into disuse, so they're actually polluted and quite problematic. But it's very clear that the ponds have been a part of the agricultural system for an extremely long time, in terms of capturing water and water being used for animals, water being used for other products, other purposes, sorry. But it's quite clear that now, I think the way that people use ponds, they're a burden. They're used for waste, so there are moves at the moment, particularly by Punjab government, is to renovate these ponds and to make them usable as a water source again. So I think it's a sort of a bit of a hidden source of water that's actually been staring everybody in the face for centuries, and we've not been thinking about it in the terms of how ancient Indus populations used that, for example. And that may be a way of getting around this challenge of the perennial versus the ephemeral rivers. If people were capturing water in dams or in ponds or in lakes, that may be an explanation as to what was happening. I think that's a really interesting possibility.
Yeah,
and Mark Kanoya started to suggest that there's a big pond at Harappa.
yeah, he adds to that. I mean, adding to that pond suggestion, where I excavated at Karanpura, the villagers, they say even 30 years back, 40 years back, they were using the village pond for every purpose, for the water necessity, for feeding the animals, and even they were harvesting a very good fish from the ponds.
Right.
But only after the piped water arrived, everything is abandoned. So it was an integral part of Haryana, Rajasthan, even up to 30 years, 40 years back. And we have each and every village of Haryana, at least, large ponds are located.
You're right about the piped water. The availability of the piped water changed everything. And we were talking to some government officials, and they were saying that the piped water was a revelation in terms of health and sanitation, but they didn't have a solution for drainage. So they didn't have sewerage solutions. So all of the traditional methods that had worked for so long were just sort of upturned. It's been a big challenge. I mean, having so much increase in population in India, it's incredibly complicated to feed everybody and infrastructurally to do all of those sorts of things. So yeah, the cultural heritage is inevitably being squeezed because it's land and everyone wants some land. So that's why the other sorts of things that we're looking at the moment, we really want to understand the distribution of the ponds and the ancient sites before they disappear. I think that's really a critical thing. And doing whatever we can in terms, I don't know, preservation is going to always be a challenge, I think. Farmers want flat land to grow crops on. So there's two more questions that come. I don't really
two more. And I see Michelle scribbling down a lot of things. I think he has a few questions. We will go to him at the end. So two more. Professor Corrisetter has a follow-up one. Was there depletion of groundwater table?
It's a really important question. We don't have the clear evidence for that at the moment. Now, absolutely. So since Green Revolution, the depletion of groundwater has just gone unbelievably fast. But what's interesting, in many areas, particularly these where we know these ancient channels were, there's still groundwater available, but it's not necessarily a very good quality. But yeah, I think that's the big change, because so much pumping is happening. The groundwater is changing now, but we don't have very good evidence for groundwater in the past. I think that's a challenge.
Yeah. So can you help me pronounce his last name? Olidam. Eric Olidam asks, is there any evidence for beer production in the Indus civilization? That will account for all the barley and wheat.
Yeah, well, maybe. I mean, it's different. It's interesting. We lack the sorts of textual information that we have from Mesopotamia that makes it very clear that Mesopotamians are using beer, and we don't have any iconography of Indus people drinking beer, to my knowledge. I may be wrong, but in Mesopotamia we absolutely have everyone drinking beer. I mean, it would be surprising if they weren't making beverages. I mean, we know in Mesopotamia also some of that the beer was not strongly alcoholic, but it was a way of fermenting problems out of the water, so it makes the water palatable. It would be interesting to know. I mean, if you're not making beer, then what's all the wheat and barley for? Is it just for bread, or is it producing other types of products that are being used? So yeah, I don't think there's any clear evidence, Eric, to be honest, at least not that I'm aware of, but that doesn't mean it wasn't happening. It's just that we don't know from the residues, for example, and I'm not quite sure whether there would be a beer residue. Maybe you might find a plant fat residue, and if that was very, very clearly associated with a specific vessel. But yeah, the residue analysis hasn't shown anything that clear. If anything, the residue analysis is very complicated. And interestingly enough, there's residue analysis being done in Gujarat that seems to be different to Haryana, which is quite interesting. There's different levels of dairying in different assemblages. So I know there is another PhD research project looking at lots of residues, I think from Harappa and different sites in Arabia and things like that. And Akshata is looking at some other samples from Arabia as well.
Okay, so I think I'll ask Professor Danino if he has any questions, and then he will kind of conclude the talk.
I have either no questions or too many questions, so I will go for no questions, because I was just trying to absorb as much as I could. You've thrown so much at us, and it's always so enriching to listen to you and to understand the complexity, endless complexity in every field, the hydrology, the agriculture, the dietary pattern, the adaptability to climate change, and so on. And it's a very good reminder that archaeology often ends up creating more questions than it can answer. So, but we have to go through that process to understand things and refrain from, as you said very rightly, from simplistic, dogmatic conclusions or declarations on how the civilization evolved. So that's all. I just would like to thank you so much on behalf of all the listeners, on behalf of IIT Gandhinagar, and we hope you can visit us in person one of these days.